Hello and welcome to HMG Network, broadcasting live from the greater Washington, D.C. metropolitan. My name is Freeman Singirankabo, and thank you for joining us for another power-packed message of our series, Truth to Power. Join our conversation today, and we are taking you all the way back to the Southern Africa in the country of Zimbabwe. And our conversation today, we are going to dive into sanctions and land reparation for the Zimbabweans in the country of Zimbabwe. So join our conversation as we explore the myth, the realities about sanctions on Zimbabwe, land reparations, and the role of the West on the issues of Zimbabwe. In today's discussion, our moderator is going to be none other than Claude Gatebuke, who is the Executive Director for the African Great Lakes Action Network, or AGLAN, and our dear Queen, Nadine Kazuba, who are going to kick us on this conversation, or who are going to be leading the conversation as we jump right in it. And our apologies also on the late start. We were dealing with a little bit of technical difficulties, but rest assured, we are ready to kick off and we are ready to rock and roll. So Claude Gatebuke, if you can hear me, brother, take it away. Good morning.
Good morning, Freeman, and good evening, Rutendo, and good morning, Nadine. It's a great honor to be a part of this conversation. And as someone born on the continent of Africa who's concerned with the well-being of our sisters and brothers on the continent and the diaspora, I am honored to be a part of this conversation. It's important to build a true African union, and this will be done by none other than us, we, the people, connecting across the continent and in the diaspora, learning and taking action. Like to quote our brother from Ethiopia, Kaya Bashir, who was previously on this broadcast, who said, we must organize, energize, and act to take our own destiny into our own hands in solving issues that affect our sisters and brothers. I could not agree more. We must be a part of the solution. I've seen our guest today in presentations, and I have to say, you are in for a treat today. The structure of our conversation today is going to be a conversation with our guest first, talking about the sanctions and land reparations in Zimbabwe. And then we'll have our guest interact with you, the audience, by responding to your comments and questions that you are sending via YouTube and Facebook. For those of you who are watching at home on your televisions, please go ahead and invite a neighbor to listen to this powerful conversation where Africans connect the dots. And if you're watching on social media, Facebook, YouTube, and other platforms, please share these links so that others can follow this conversation. Our conversation today is with my fabulous co-host, Nadine Kazuba. Nadine, it's a great honor to co-host with you again, and I look forward to this conversation. Take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Claude. I'm very pleased to be here co-hosting this broadcast of Truth to Power with you as usual. So today we have a special guest from the country of Zimbabwe, who is going to tell us the issues the country of Zimbabwe is facing. We will also be connecting that with the rest of the African continent, comparing and contrasting different issues on the continent to what is currently happening in Zimbabwe. Before we begin, I would like to give you a little bit of geography and history on the country of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is located in the Southern Africa, and it has a history of colonization and land dispossession by white settlers who came from Europe in the 16th century and forced indigenous Black Africans off their ancestral lands and occupied those lands. In 1980, Zimbabwe got independence after a long liberation war and negotiation between African natives and white colonialists. So without spending much time, let me introduce our special guest today. He's our brother. He's an activist. He's also one of for those who know him, he's one of our favorite Pan-Africanists. His name is Mr. Rutendo Matinyarare. Rutendo is also the chairperson and the director of the Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement, ZASM, whose purpose is to challenge the unlawful sanctions on Zimbabwe and their negative effects on ordinary Zimbabwean. So welcome, Rutendo. Welcome on our show. We give you a warm African welcome, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. So besides being our greatest Pan-Africanist, can you please share with the audience a little bit more about yourself? Because we know you have a lot of greatness in you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nadine. And I'm blown away by the fact that you're one of the first people that begin to talk about Zimbabwe in a context that starts in the 1600s. So just like Rwanda, we have a nation that did not start with colonialism. It started way before colonialism. And it was one of the 6 empires on the African continent. So I'm grateful for you bringing that up. I'm Rutendo Matinyarare, born in Harare. And I was born and raised in a family with a mother and a father, blessed to have a mother and a father raise me through and through. I studied marketing and brand management. And with that, I started a marketing consultancy to do what every marketer thinks needs to be done, which is to sell products. And as I was selling products, I began to question myself. The products that I'm selling, who am I selling them to, and what is the purpose of selling them? And when I began to realize that I was an instrument of colonialism by selling products to drive consumerism on the African continent, I'm a marketer who changes people's minds to ingrain Western products into people's minds, because the West are the companies that usually have the resources to make people consume. And it's when I was selling or marketing a brand called Procter & Gamble, I think they're the fastest consumer moving goods company in the world, I began to question, why am I driving the agenda to push Procter & Gamble products in Africa, when Procter & Gamble does not manufacture most of its products in Africa, when most of Procter & Gamble's products are toxic and poisonous, and they cause problems in our environment? Why, as a marketer, am I involved with that? That was the first time I started asking questions. The second time was when I was approached by Pfizer in 2018, well before the vaccination campaign that is there now, and they wanted my marketing agency to assist them in doing radio ads for seasonal flu vaccines. And they were offering quite a lot of money, $300,000 US to do 2 reads and to place them on a number of, and to package them and to get voiceover artists and just basically position them and place them on a number of outlets. And the profit that we're going to make there was over 50%. But I started asking myself, how can I be a person that doesn't accept vaccines for my own children, but now I'm going to use my marketing agency to sell Pfizer products and Pfizer vaccines to other people's children, into other people's lives? So I refused that job. Another job was a Ford Foundation job, where we were asked to bid for telling the African story from a Ford Foundation perspective. I'm talking about a company that has a eugenics history, a company that existed at a time where African Americans were oppressed by institutions like the Ford Foundation, Ford and other institutions of eugenicists that built America and the billionaires that built America. And I question myself, why am I involved with that? It's at that point that I realized that my marketing was not being used for a proper job, and I needed to start looking at how to use my marketing to change African minds, to serve African interests, to social engineer Africans on what is good for them and not what is good for Western companies on the African continent. Immediately, I stopped marketing Western products. Immediately, I said that even if we lose money as a consultancy, because the companies that usually have the money to advertise and market happen to be Western, happen to be colonial companies that benefited from colonialism and slavery. But I said, it's fine. Africa is desperately in need of remarketing, of brand management. We need to create a new story about Africa, new brand values, ethos that are associated and linked with African culture. And that is when I began the journey. And this brings me to my love and love-hate relationship with Rwanda, in the aspect that one of the people that has understood the importance of marketing in Africa on a level that is almost international is Kagame. And he also happens to be the person that I dislike the most among our leaders because of certain things that have fractured the way he does what he does with such excellence, but divorced from African interest and divorced from African values. And so this is who I am today, working towards rebranding Africa. And I cannot talk about rebranding Africa when my own country as a tattered brand. My own country is ununited, it's fragmented, and it has got problems that have been caused by sabotage, colonial education that has miseducated the people, mental issues caused by the psychological warfare of almost 200 to 300 years of colonialism, and now the impact of sanctions that are deliberately being used to divide our people. I need to bring my country together first, before I can join other Pan-Africanists to try and create a new story, a new brand for Africa. Because if I cannot succeed in Zimbabwe, then I can never succeed in assisting building the brand of Africa.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I knew, like I say, there is a lot of greatness in you. And it's actually, it's one of the things that, like I always say, Africans, we have to detach ourselves from all these material things from the West, because they're not here to help us, but to corrupt our minds. Like just for you to decide to push away Pfizer and push away all these companies that wanted you to sell their products, but you knew they were not good for us, and you decided to give that money away and just decided to promote the wellness of Africans. And I think that's an example we all have to look up on you and follow that step. But so we're gonna go ahead
Nadine,
and start.
I think the one thing before you start, as you were speaking, Brother Rutendo, I just kept thinking, you know, we're gonna have to challenge you on these colonial borders, you know. But other than that, I love the message. So please take it away, Nadine.
Okay. Yeah. So moving on.
Can I just answer that? Can I just answer that quickly? And I agree with you. But you know, I always say to people, before we can even bring down the colonial borders, we have to make sure that within the territories that we have, we change the mindset of our people to understand that these colonial borders are not right. So that means a decolonization process where we can get influence among our people. And over time, when they understand their agenda, we begin to break the borders and begin to, unite with everybody else. I agree with you that the borders are not right. They cause problems. The language barriers are not right. The cultural issues that we focus on in our own little countries are not right. We must break them apart. I agree with you 100%. Absolutely.
Yeah, so moving on, as today our focus is in your country, Zimbabwe, and sanctions. So we would like to educate people and to know exactly what is happening, because like right now, a lot of people, when they talk about sanctions in Zimbabwe, there is a current narrative. And the current narrative is from US government websites, it's from a European Union websites, it's from the mainstream media that is mostly controlled by the powerful nations, by the West. And so the narrative says that the Zimbabwe is under sanctions because of a lack of progress in democratic and human rights reforms, as well as restrictions on press freedom. So we would like to know, Rutendo, are you there?
I'm here, sorry.
Yeah, so we would like to know if this current narrative, what we see in the mainstream media, what we see on the US websites and the UK, is that the truth of the reason why the Zimbabwe is under sanctions? Because current narrative, speaking of my experience, or people from Rwanda, we know the current narrative is always different from what the reality is on the site. So can you please tell us the reasons why Zimbabwe is under sanctions? I mean, you have the Zimbabwe anti-sanction movement. You understand very well the problem. So we would like you to give us reasons why the country of Zimbabwe was put under sanction.
Thank you so much. And I think at this point, it's very important for me, in line with what it is that Brother Claude brought up, to make sure that I dovetail what I'm going to say about Zimbabwe into a broader understanding of why this is important for Africa and why it's important for people to understand why the fight in Zimbabwe must be won, the fight in Rwanda, the fight in Congo must be won, so that we can get to a point where we can start building Pan-Africa. Because ever since the beginning of the Pan-Africanist journey, we were always a continent that was divided into little parts. So the colonial territories that were created by the Berlin Conference began to manifest themselves even when we got independence, because African countries got independence at different times. They were influenced by different colonizers, which continued to solidify the division between nations. However, within that, there were certain people that believed in Pan-Africanism. So they were the Casablanca, a group that believed in Pan-Africanism that needed to bring countries together as quickly as possible. There was another group of people that were nationalists that believed that we need to continue with the agenda of developing as nations before rushing to merge. I come from a country of a Pan-Africanist who went through to Ghana to ask the Ghanaian president to train our very first soldiers and troops to get independence. So with that, our leadership was influenced greatly by Kwame Nkrumah and the concept and the aspect of Pan-Africanism. When we got our independence, that Pan-Africanism began to be ingrained in the national ethos and the value system of the fact that we need to come together as Africa, and we need to free Africa together before we can begin to enjoy the benefits of liberation as a united Africa. So for that reason, my country got independence at exactly the same time where the Europeans were beginning to coalesce around apartheid South Africa to ensure that apartheid South Africa would continue to be white, would not be defeated in a war as the Rhodesian government, which was the previous Zimbabwean government, which was white. It was defeated, and the colonial powers, which had created a bastion of protection in the south, with Mozambique controlled by the Portuguese, and Rhodesia that was controlled by the British, together with South Africa, were trying to protect themselves to keep this as a stronghold for white colonial powers like we see in Australia and the United States, so that they could continue to exert their influence on the African continent, or the Black African continent, led by these white states. So with that, the South African apartheid government had created something called CONSAS, the Constellation of Southern African States. The logic behind this was fed into by Henry Kissinger, who said that we cannot allow this area of Southern Africa to fall into Black control. We also cannot allow the Black liberation forces that are winning independence from Mozambique to Zimbabwe to Angola to continue to fight and win against white governments, because then it's going to radicalize the rest of the African continent, including the French African countries that had been given independence on paper, but they had not been given true independence because they didn't fight for their independence. So with that, they decided to say, let's make sure that we strengthen South Africa, and South Africa must exert influence to stop the overthrow of apartheid. And that needed to start off with the creation of an organization called CONSAS, Constellation of African States, in which South Africa would lead all these independent Southern African states in a collective federation controlled by a white government that would then tell the world that this white government in South Africa was legitimate and accepted by its neighbors in Southern Africa. Therefore, there was no apartheid, or at least apartheid, which means separate development, is legal. When we got independence, South Africa was actively asking our leaders to join this CONSAS. But at the same time, something called SADC had been created, Southern African Development Community, developed by the Black states, that said we do not want to be associated with the apartheid state because it's illegitimate and it stands for the same colonizers that used to colonize us before. So we're going to create a separate unit. And this separate unit is going to work hard to break the dependency that the whole of Southern Africa had on the South African economy, the South African transport system, the South African banking system, communication system, almost everything. And the moment Zimbabwe decided to join other Southern African states or other Black Southern African states in SADC, instead of going for CONSAS, immediately it went into the radar of the CIA and the South African government, and all the Western states that wanted to maintain South Africa's white power in Southern Africa to exert that influence to the rest of the continent. So that automatically meant that there was a war between Southern Africa, with Zimbabwe as the center because it was the country with the most infrastructure and the most industry at that time in Southern Africa. So South Africa realized Zimbabwe as an arm of fighting imperialism or apartheid, so they decided to attack it. The way they decided to attack African countries was different in the Southern African region. Some were attacked economically, some were attacked militarily, some were attacked politically, and some were attacked militarily, and a combination of the others. Zimbabwe falls in the category that we were being sabotaged economically, we're being sabotaged militarily by them funding forces within Zimbabwe. They also then, because Zimbabwe is landlocked, they began to attack our route to port in Mozambique. And by attacking our route to port, they were doing two things. Attacking Zimbabwe's route to port so that Zimbabwe could not be economically self-sufficient. And if they blocked the Mozambican way to port, the only other way to port would have been South Africa or Namibia. And Namibia was also controlled by South Africa. And by so doing, by fighting our route in Mozambique, they were also fighting Mozambique to stop Mozambique from supporting ANC, MK veterans, which was the armed wing of ANC, and AZAPO, which was the armed wing of the PAC, from being able to operate in Mozambique. Zimbabwe had to send its soldiers into Mozambique just 2 years after independence. So this is before you start building a country, before you start understanding how to run a country as a liberation movement. You've been given a government that is broke, a treasury that is broke, and all of a sudden you're thrust into a war by the biggest superpower of the region, because you have to defend your route to port, but you also have to defend your neighboring country, Mozambique, that assisted you to get your independence in Zimbabwe. So that's what started happening immediately when we got independence. So the Pan-African ethos was already put into action when our army had to be put together. And remember, they united three separate armies: the army of the Rhodesians, and they put together that with the two liberation movements that were not exactly in good books, and they had to create one military. And just as they were gluing this military together, they had to go and fight in Mozambique. And they also had to fight at home, where this other division of the liberation movement, we had two of them. We had the ZANU-PF and we had the ZAPU. The ZANU-PF and ZAPU were divided, and they were divided loosely by tribalism. And this tribal division, when the armies were being brought together after independence, some people within ZAPU, just like people within ZANU, did not get positions in the new army, and they decided to create a rebel movement that was being financed by the South Africans and the CIA to destabilize Zimbabwe, to try and cause a tribal war. So they tried to do the Hutu-Tutsi thing in Zimbabwe. They tried to do what they have done in Congo to get different tribes to fight each other. And with that, the government had to deploy its own soldiers in its own country. Yes, sir.
It's also what they're doing with the Tigrinya and the Oromos and all that in Ethiopia today. Just to connect
Correct, my brother.
Yep.
Yes,
going,
absolutely.
Please. That's what I wanted to add currently, when it's happening currently. Also in South Sudan, same thing.
Also in West Africa, in Nigeria, it's happening as well. Biafra, and that's correct, my brother. I love the way you bring it together. So this divide and conquer is what they've done on the African continent and what they were trying to employ in Zimbabwe. And they felt that if they did it successfully in Zimbabwe, it would then allow this country that they believed was going to be the most powerful to fight apartheid. If it collapses, then the fight against apartheid ends. And in Mozambique, they were already fighting that tribal war with the creation of this arm called Renamo. Renamo was created, and ironically, my brother, what's sad is Renamo was created in Zimbabwe. And it was created in Zimbabwe with Zimbabweans who were being used while we're in the liberation war to disturb the liberation fighters with an army of black Zimbabweans who were destabilizing the liberation fighters so that they would not get successful. When we succeeded, Renamo was taken by the South Africans. These Zimbabweans were then trained by the South Africans to go into a neighboring country and to become a rebel movement that recruits neighbors to fight against their own country. That's how Renamo came in. So Zimbabwe had to go into Mozambique to fight Zimbabweans and Mozambicans who had formed a rebel movement that was destabilizing Mozambique. That war then culminated in the defeat of Renamo. The defeat of Renamo then caused the South African apartheid government to be under pressure because it was running out of resources, as it was also fighting a war in Angola and in Namibia. In Angola, the Cubans were called to come and back up MPLA that was then fighting against a rebel unit again on a tribal basis that was being funded by the CIA and the South Africans. But the South Africans eventually deployed their own soldiers there. With the defeat in Mozambique, that meant that what they were trying to use Mozambique and Zimbabwe for, which is a buffer zone from troops of SADC entering, or troops of Africa entering to attack South African apartheid government on South African soil, had now fallen away on the east side. And then when they were starting to be pressured in Angola, where Zimbabwean troops ended up also going together with MK soldiers of the ANC to fight in Angola, they got defeated in Angola. When the Boers got defeated in Angola, the negotiation process forced them to also leave Namibia that they had been using as a colony. And that meant they went back into their country without the buffer zone or these nations in the forefront that they used to use as a means to be a buffer between them and Africa, or them and other SADC countries from invading South African territory. Once that happened, they were forced to negotiate with the ANC. And that is the beginning of Zimbabwe's enmity with the West. That what kind of a little country of black people that are supposed to be useless, black people that are supposed to be incapable of organizing, black people who are supposed to be animalistic and unable to create anything concrete, to have defeated Europeans on Zimbabwean soil, Europeans in Mozambique, while the other African countries in Southern Africa had also come together to defeat the Europeans or the South Africans in Angola and Namibia. The enmity started there. And the enmity was, you've become a bad influence, a bad slave that teaches other people how to resist the authority of white men on the African continent. And I need to just put this in the context that Zimbabwe was especially a problem in that when our liberation war was when the whites were losing the war in Zimbabwe, they began to use mercenaries recruited by the American government, mercenaries of the Vietnamese. The Americans were fighting wars in Vietnam. When they were losing Vietnam War, they began to take the commandos, they began to take the Navy SEALs, they began to take the Green Berets who were coming from Vietnam and sending them to Rhodesia to help the Rhodesian government. They were taking Israeli soldiers, Iranian soldiers, because at that time Iran was still run by the Shah, who was associated with the Americans. They were taking British soldiers, SAS, Australian SAS to come and fight for the Rhodesians. So the defeat of the Rhodesian government was a defeat of American special forces, British special forces, Australian special forces, Israeli special forces, and all these white peoples that had come as mercenaries to try and keep up this Rhodesian government. And they felt that this was going to influence South African freedom fighters to do the same. And what's ironic is that at that very same time when our liberation fighters were training in Tanzania, they met with Kagame, they met with our friend Museveni, who were also training as liberation movements in Tanzania. You know what I mean? That just goes to show how we are interlinked, interconnected, and our liberation movements are people that have worked together, lived together. Now, this is where the cracks now comes. So we've now...
Rutendo, here's one thing I want to add on. It's amazing how Zimbabwe was fighting for a good cause. Like they were helping all these other countries liberate for a good cause. But then, yeah, of course, you have those people, Museveni, Kagame, they are in there among the true liberators, but they are indeed mercenaries of the West, because that's something we happen to see after. And that is one of the reasons why people like Nyerere was so, he helped them. He helped Kagame, he helped Museveni. He actually helped Museveni take Uganda, and then also he helped Kagame taking over Rwanda. Yeah, Nyerere is one of the Pan-Africanists I adore, I respect, but he was strict, because we all human, we can get tricked. So yeah, it's like we have these good liberators, Zimbabweans are fighting, they're helping Mozambique, they're helping in Angola, but then you have people like Kagame with a different agenda. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
You know,
I love the
every place that has noise, there's a thief. So, you know, somebody came and hijacked, you know, among the noise. But I just want to add one little thing also. Believe it or not, I have met two men. One is British. He fought in that war that you're talking about. He was referring to Mugabe and the Zimbabwean freedom fighters as terrorists. This was in the 2000s. He was still referring to them as terrorists. I met another one. He's an American. He's a very old man now, who was once captured. Initially, he didn't reveal what country it was that he was captured in and tortured. But then he later revealed to me that he was in Zimbabwe. And so, you know, the things that you're saying, I've actually met people that were a part of these things. That please proceed. The crux of the crux of it.
I love that, and I wish we need you to put that in writing. I know this is a documentation, but you also need to put that in writing. It's amazing to see how the pieces of the puzzle start to fit in when we as Pan-Africanists start talking together. And
that's
as we
why
said,
we have connected dots. I said that's why we have to connect the dots, because eventually it's one particular problem we have. And yeah, go ahead.
and this is where I need to give credit to you, Nadine, because it is you that gave me certain pieces of the puzzle that were missing, that didn't make sense. And when you put those pieces of the puzzle, it all started making sense, that we are one and we have one problem, and the enemy knows us more than we know ourselves.
Correct.
Because when I discovered that Museveni, Kagame, and a lot of the other guys that are now in the story of the Great Lakes were also in Tanzania, training with the liberators of this continent, training with the great men of this continent. They were not training for the same reasons as these men, but these men did not understand. They had an agenda that had already been instilled by the enemy way before the liberators had a full vision of what was happening.
Correct.
And now when you understand how things are rolling out today, and that's credit to you, my sister. You gave me those pieces of the puzzle. You know what I mean?
Yes.
All goes to say infiltration is a real thing.
My guy,
every movement.
It's too real. But what Nadine has done is she's infiltrated in the opposite, in the counter-revolutionary manner, to teach what it is that was not clear from the beginning. Yeah. Because all I knew is that the sanctions on Zimbabwe are associated with what is happening in Rwanda. All right. I started to know that the sanctions in Zimbabwe have everything to do with the genocide. And then I also started understanding that the genocide and what it is not what we are told, because it's part and parcel of the agenda to break what it is that we're trying to build in Africa, which is our unity. And so that brings me to the fact that when we defeated the apartheid government, someone would think that it was defeated in Mozambique, it was defeated in Angola, the CIA was defeated, and now we had a Southern Africa that was in one order that they wanted to use to project imperialism into the African continent. That was no longer possible, at least that's what we thought, until we then realized Laurent Kabila coming down to Zimbabwe and saying, please come and help me, I'm about to get overthrown. And we're thinking, but you just overthrew Mobutu Sese Seko. You just removed Mobutu Sese Seko. So why should it be a problem? And he's saying, no, they are rebels coming from Uganda. They are rebels coming from Rwanda. They are rebels coming from Burundi.
Backed by United States. They were backed on the top of that, backed by United States and UK and
France.
The West.
And France, yes. And what was, but remember, I'm trying to give you the perspective of what was happening in Zimbabwe. The Zimbabweans did not fully understand the problem of what was going there. But there was a military general who had actually written a thesis on the Great Lakes. He had written a thesis about the relationship between Kagame, Museveni, and what the agenda of these men was to develop a reinstitution of a Mapororo empire that had last been seen in the 16th century. And this man wrote these pieces, gave it to the government and the military, and they did not give a damn about these pieces. But when what's his name? Laurent Kabila came through to Harare in September 1998. After everybody thought that the war that was happening in the Great Lakes has nothing to do with us, and he started explaining, then they had to tell this general that, please, can you bring your document back? They had to remove the dust of this document and start reading it again. And immediately Mugabe held a SADC meeting in Harare and said to SADC, Congo is one of us. We have got to go and defend Congo from this territorial invasion by these other powers. And other guys were saying, but those are Pan-Africanists. They was like, no, when you read this document, they are not Pan-African. And this invasion of another territory in Africa has nothing to do with Pan-African. It is then that they had to send a fact-finding mission that went and landed in Uganda. From Uganda, it went to Rwanda. From Rwanda, it went to Congo, it went to Tanzania, and the story became totally different. Even the understanding of what had happened during the so-called, the genocide was now blown into a different context. So Zimbabwe came back and said to SADC, we have to intervene now. There's no time to wait for tomorrow. Because the French had airlifted rebels and soldiers from Uganda and Rwanda. It was not just rebels. They're called rebels, but actually they were national armies that were involved in there, that had been lifted to even the east of Congo, the west of Congo, Goma, and a place called Matadi, and they were ready to destroy Congo to overthrow Kabila. So by the time the Southern African forces, which included Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Angola, got into Congo, the rebels were already in Kinshasa, ready to march onto the palace and to remove Kabila. And the reason they wanted to remove Kabila is Kabila wanted the resources of Congo to revert back to serve the Congolese people. While Kagame was saying, my brother, you've got a Tutsi wife, you come from here, you grew up here, we ate with you, you know what me and Museveni are organizing. So it's time that you give back to us, the people who gave you the freedom. And Kabila was saying, no, my people are starving in a country that is so wealthy. And that is the fight. So when we fought this war and forced a situation where Kabila wasn't overthrown, the second agenda that had happened is that the UN actually wanted Kagame and Museveni to cause such a lot of death and chaos that the UN would put in a proposal that was already put to the fighting forces that let's divide Congo into 5. We divide Congo into 5, make sure that different tribes live in their own, so that we don't have war and we have peace. But Zambia, which was the middleman in this, together with the Zimbabwean government, had written a proposal that said we need to share power. So let's talk, we share power, the foreign forces inside Congo leave, and then we have peace. Fortunately, all the members agreed to this Zambian-Zimbabwean document that asked for at the beginning of peace talks, the beginning of cessation of hostilities, and refused this option of dividing Africa again into another extra 5 different territories. And of course, those territories have been managed by power. So this is what eventually caused the Americans and the British and the West to say, this Zimbabwe has been a problem for 20 years. It has been a problem, in fact, for 34 years since independence fights. It's time to destroy it. And the best way to destroy this country that wants to build Pan-Africanism by using its army, by using its economic power, is to put it under sanctions, to deprive it of money, deprive it of resources. Hence, we get into the first sanctions. And those first sanctions coincide with the European sponsoring what used to be a trade union. I hear someone wanting to speak.
Yeah, I want to stop you for a second, because a couple of things that you said, the dividing up of the Congo, you know, this is a real thing. They call it the Balkanization of the Congo. People denied that this was happening. And I want to kick a shout out to our brother, Kambale Musavuli. Not sure if you're watching, but I'm sure at some point you're going to watch this. And the other Congolese and friends of the Congo who were one of the sponsors for this broadcast, who and other many Congolese, millions of Congolese who resisted this dividing up of the Congo. But the reason I'm kicking a shout out to Kambale, there is a lot of times when people deny things, there's documentation. We have video. I just wish that we knew that you would talk about this so that we could ask the studio to load it up, of Kambale Musavuli challenging an American ambassador on, I believe it was Al Jazeera, I can't remember which broadcast it was, where the American ambassador was pushing for the dividing up of the Congo. But I think the work that was done by the Congolese people to resist the Balkanization of the Congo was amazing. And it cannot be understated, because they continue to divide up Africa further than it is. You know, it's to weaken the continent. And I think that's what you were getting at, plus, you know, the other reasons. So I will hand it back to you, but I just wanted to agree with you, but also give some documentation so that the audience can see it. We'll load it in the description of this video so that you can see that evidence yourself. The Congolese people that resisted, you know, this dividing up of the Congo. If it wasn't for the Congolese people and the other Africans who fought for Congo staying together, Congo would have been annexed by Rwanda and Uganda.
And it would be a disaster too. On the top of that, even though, I mean, there's still a lot of stuff going on in Congo, because Kagame hasn't left, Museveni hasn't left, they are still there. But the lack of them losing the ability to do the balkanization of Congo, they have lost a lot, because otherwise the resources that will just be handed to Kagame and Museveni and the West, even though they are still doing it, but it won't be the same.
And I love what you're saying. Claude, thanks for such enriching information. And let me tell you why that's so important for you to keep putting in this information, and why this video is actually going to be instrumental even in the writing of new works, is that the current works that exist on the issue of Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda, or let's call it the Great Lakes region, a lot of them are written in French. And we've got very little narratives that are written in English. And so therefore, I'm learning this as I go. And I'm saying, why doesn't the documentation exist? And I've realized that the documentation exists because the English-speaking Africans don't care about what is happening in the so-called French-speaking Africa. And I'm thinking that's absolutely unacceptable. But I'm grateful in the aspect that Rwanda has got a special character of being. You guys are organized. You guys are very pedantic. You have a different mindset to a lot of people on the African continent, including my people, because Zimbabweans don't really care much about some of the things that I've seen you guys caring about. The fact that there's so many groups that talk about the history of Rwanda, the history of the Great Lakes, and so many people getting arrested for telling a history. You guys are not just being arrested because of resisting the government. You're actually being arrested for telling the history. In Zimbabwe, we've never heard of that, where people get arrested for telling the history because people don't see history as important. You guys in Rwanda understand the importance of history. So it is from you that we're going to begin to build the knowledge basis of what history that is disappearing, history that the Americans and the West want to disappear. It's people like the Congolese people that talk about this balkanization that I only discovered recently, that we are going to be able to start teaching people the importance of history for our own good, and start making people understand that sometimes I think history is much more important than any other subject. In fact, we should have that as a foundation and everything else falls. So I'm loving it because
Yeah, without cutting you off, yeah, I would like to add on something because, yeah, Rwandans, I mean, it became like learning about problems about other countries. It's something that happened. I probably would say, like, before the war in Rwanda, Rwandans were just like any other Africans. We were just living there. We felt like the country is peaceful. I mean, we will hear like stuff on the news, what is happening around. But after we left the country, after Kagame took over Rwanda, and after we saw what the media was saying about what is happening in Rwanda, and how the majority of Hutu refugees were being abused, were being denied their rights, being called the genocidaire, like they killed Tutsis. I mean, you can't have 85% of the population kill Tutsis, like kill the entire 15% of Tutsis, and you can't say like the entire population was doing that. There were Hutu militias who were killing Tutsis during genocide, but the blame, it was kind of put on the entire population of the Hutu refugees. The majority of Hutu, like you could not go anywhere. Any country you was going to, you was labeled as a such. You are a genocidaire. We couldn't, our passport became invalid. We couldn't go anywhere. As soon as they find out, oh, you are from the Hutu ethnicity, you can't do anything. So that's when a lot of people started waking up and start thinking like, what is happening? Why the world is so against us? What have we done? And by that, we started learning histories of other countries. What is happening in the other countries? You hear this story, what is happening in Zimbabwe. If you see that in the mainstream media, you have to think twice. You have to be like, okay, is that true? Because I know my story was completely falsified. So with Zimbabwe, I was like, okay, what I'm seeing on the CNN, what I'm seeing in BBC, what I'm seeing on the US website or UK, I'm like, okay, there's no way it will be true. I have to ask Zimbabweans who actually know exactly what is happening on the site. So that's why a lot of Rwandans are so focused on such a kind of issues, because our history has been completely changed. It has been told the way it was. It's not supposed. The way it did not happen, I would say. Yeah.
And that's amazing. I think Claude wanted to say something. Claude?
No, I was agreeing with Nadine. The history of Rwanda has been distorted. The lies have been basically put at the forefront, and the truth has been flipped on its head in many ways, and that's what is being undone. And also, the one thing that you said about connecting the dots. Actually, this network that also sponsors these conversations, HMG, is part of the goal is to connect those dots between the Anglophones and the Francophone. We actually kicked off our French programs. I believe it was 2 weeks ago, or maybe it wasn't last. So it was 2 weeks ago, I think. So this is going to connect, the communities, not just us. We're not taking credit for connecting everyone because we already connected with many of the various languages, but we're going to make a big effort to continue doing that. And we are committed to doing that.
Yeah.
And I hope that by giving the narrative that Zimbabwe's sanctions had a lot to do with what is happening in Congo and Rwanda, and the fact that the Zimbabwean army ended up having to go to Chad and Somalia and other African countries in the Great Lakes region to try and bring peace, to try and protect civilians, women and children. I hope it begins to not only take the story of Zimbabwe and put it in a different light, but I hope it begins to make people understand the fact that we are one body. And right now, one part of the body, which is the hands, is tied behind the back. It's tied behind the back figuratively by the sanctions and the attack on these hands, so that the rest of the body cannot fight back. But while the hands are tied behind the back, which is this Zimbabwe and the sanctions, an engine that has been fighting for Africa all out through the Central African region, through the West African region. They've got soldiers in Equatorial Guinea trying to assist Equatorial Guinea after the South African Boers white people tried to undertake a coup there. I hope people would understand why we need to talk about the hands behind the back, and why we need to untie the hands behind the back if Africa is going to be able to have its hands up and its legs and its head to headbutt to fight back an enemy that is not only not restricted, but there are many of these enemies. So we are fighting France, the United States, England, Europe, the Australians, the Canadians. Their arms are not tied, and they are fighting at their fullest. And they've got weapons, they've got superior weapons to us. But this Africa has got some of its hands behind its back. Hands behind its back in the form of Zimbabwe under sanctions, in the form of France Afrique, in the form of certain powerful nations like Rwanda that are still undertaking a colonial agenda, and Uganda also taking the same colonial agenda. To some extent, even Rwanda and Uganda fighting each other. Yet, if we could have these hands untied, then we can begin to fight as a whole body. And as we fight as a whole body, we can become Africa united once again. And I want, Claude, to make you understand that that's why, for now, I have to talk about the hands that are behind the back. I have to focus on untying the hands. So my fingers are working to try and untie this. And it seems as if I'm obsessed about the hands. No, I'm not. I understand that until the hands are untied, we have the Zimbabwe untied. We have South Africa, which is also still a colony, by the way, because they let the apartheid government continue to manifest in economic power by not taking away what was made during the crime against humanity. And so once we untie those fingers and I untie the hands, now we can say, you see, the hands are untied. How do we now coordinate between the hands, the feet, the head, and the rest of the body? Yeah.
Go ahead, keep going.
Because what was starting to happen is when many of my videos were Pan-Africanists, talking generally about Pan-Africanism and bringing Africa together. The attack I used to get from a lot of people is that you can't even unite your own country, but you want to talk about bringing Africa together. You're a dreamer, you're a madman. And because of that, I became somebody who's not credible in what I'm saying. Because if I can't bring unity in one little country and then one little region, and then take that region together with other regions to bring them together, then we are never going to be able to get Africa free. And I had to agree with that. And I also had to agree that the agenda was to break Zimbabwe through these sanctions, because Zimbabwe not only got punished for going into Congo, it not only got punished for taking its army into Congo to keep Congo whole, but it also got punished for taking land and giving its people land. And if you remember, the Congo story is about Kagame wanting to take the resources and the land of Congo for these people to enjoy that. And that is what he was being destroyed for. Idi Amin, someone might say, Idi Amin got removed by Obote, and then eventually we had the removal of Obote by, Museveni, because they wanted to serve their people and their nation as a whole, while Museveni had an agenda to serve a certain group of people and certain tribes rather than, the African agenda. Because the moment we become tribal, we've lost the African agenda. The moment we start fighting as tribes and taking resources as tribes, we've lost the African agenda. So this is what it is that led Zimbabwe to the sanctions. We took our land. We said, let's give it to everybody. And let's give it to the poorest of the poorest. Right now, one of the richest businessmen in Zimbabwe is a man who came from a little unknown village. Today, I was hearing this guy where he comes from, and I look how big he is. And I said, only in Zimbabwe and a few other African countries can a person come from a little obscure village to become the most powerful man in the country. And that is only available and possible if the land is accessible to the people, if the resources are available to the people. And right now, Zimbabwe is under sanctions so that other African countries do not see that example, that take the land, give it to people, give it free access to everyone, and let everybody use the land and be able to develop themselves. Let every Zimbabwean have access to mineral resources. Right now, we've got 1.4 million gold miners in Zimbabwe, in a country with 14 million people. You want to mine gold, you go and apply for a license, you can mine. And when you make your gold, you can make your money. And this is lifting a lot of people out of poverty. And the West know that if that is an example that then becomes set in Africa and among other countries, it's going to change Africa, and it will make Africans chuck out European companies and Europeans from the continent from controlling these resources. And remember, once we start mining the resources, the next phase is I want to use the profits I've made from the resources I've mined, the gold I've mined, the chrome I've mined, to process. So now I want to smelt it. And from smelting it, I then want to turn it into something. And the Europeans would go out of business the moment Africa does that. So that's why the sanctions are on Zimbabwe on a bigger scale of things. So I just wanted to put that on the ground, and then we can use that to take us forward.
Yeah. Also, I want to add on something really quick, because like back to the current narrative that is believed, like a violation of human rights and restriction on press freedom. Those were the allegations these Western countries had on Zimbabwe. But if we can look again in Africa, if we can look on Rwanda, we can look Uganda, we can look Nigeria, human rights violations, let's just focus on Rwanda itself or Congo. Kagame, he has attacked in Congo. He has killed over 6 million of people. Those are like the worst human rights violations that ever happened in this century. And then he's still killing people in Congo because he still have people fighting there. And if you look in Uganda, we saw human rights violations last year during the elections. And all those countries, they don't get put on sanctions. But Zimbabwe, we haven't had anything major like that happening that they really had to be on sanctions. Even that, they, like you always say, they're supposed to have a due process to put a country or somebody on sanctions. But all these countries are out there doing whatever they want, killing people in other countries, and nothing gets done. But then, yeah, a country that is actually trying to help its own people, liberating other African countries, gets put on sanctions. So I think
in addition, Nadine, you're talking about Uganda, the human rights violations, you know, during the elections, even before, inside of Uganda has the Museveni government has committed genocide against the Acholi people. Anybody who hasn't seen it, watch the film, A Brilliant Genocide. It's a documentary, not Hollywood. Uganda has invaded every country that borders it, except for Tanzania. It's invaded Kenya, South Sudan, Congo, Rwanda, and you know they've committed mass atrocities inside of the Congo, inside of Uganda. Same thing with Rwanda, you know, which Rwanda is basically an offshoot of, you know, the Kagame and the RPF regime is an offshoot of the NRM. It's copy paste. The NRM in Uganda is, you know, the RPF is copy paste of what they did. Yeah. And they've committed massacres inside of Rwanda and gone into the Congo and are still committing massacres there today. And we can go on and on. There's South Sudan. There is so many places where there is human rights abuses and the lack of democratic what is it called? Lack of democratic
like
processes or something like that. I mean, if you look at that ridiculous election in Uganda, earlier this year, you can tell the same reason Zimbabwe is on sanctions. Uganda should be on sanctions. Rwanda should be on sanctions. The Congo should be on sanctions. South Sudan, and you name it. If we go by that standard, but Zimbabwe has been singled out. I think that's the question you were asking, right?
Yeah.
So,
no, it wasn't a question. I was just trying to make people understand that it's not human rights violation. It's more. It's just something different. Like Rutendo just described, the whole reasons why Zimbabwe was put on sanctions is because Zimbabwe wants its resources to be for its own people. It wants its lands back. It wants all that. It's not. That's the reason why they were put on sanctions. But let's forget about the whole human rights violations, because so many countries, then they should be on sanctions by now if we have to look at that.
And not only that, the saying that Zimbabwe was put on sanctions in 2001 because of violence against the opposition. There were no people that died in 2001 in any of the elections. That's one. Number two, the elections were held after a referendum was held. where Mugabe's government, or ZANU-PF, wanted to have a vote in a referendum to allow, to get permission from the people to change the constitution to then be able to take land without compensating white farmers. So that was happening in 2001. And when, I'm sorry, in 2000. And that year is the same year that we had the parliamentary elections. Now listen to how interesting this is. So the process begins to roll on. We have a trade union that was created in the period of colonialism to fight the owners of capital and white farmers who oppress black people. This trade union was fighting the colonial system. And when we got independence, this trade union continued to fight white capital because they continued to own industry, they continued to own the land, they continued to be the farmers. So they were always fighting these white property owners and capitalists for controlling too many resources and exploiting the African labor in exactly the same way that was happening during colonialism. It got to a point where between 1990 and 1997, Zimbabwe had the second biggest stock exchange in Africa after South Africa. And it was more profitable than the South African Stock Exchange, which for the past 130 years has been the most profitable stock exchange in the world because of exploiting black labor and the resources of South Africa. Now, between 1990 and 1997, Zimbabwe's stock exchange overtook the South African Stock Exchange in terms of returns to investors. That goes to show you the level of exploitation of Zimbabweans that was happening and the Zimbabwean resources. So at this time that people were saying Zimbabwe is a food basket, white farmers were making a killing from exporting flowers, tobacco, and that kind of stuff, with monies not even coming back to Zimbabwe but staying overseas. They were making a killing from mining, and the industry was very minuscule compared to the mining and agriculture. It is from that point that this trade union was fighting these capitalists. And all of a sudden we get to 1999, Mugabe announces to the world that I've been waiting for the British to do what they agreed to do in 1980 when we had the Lancaster House Agreement that said that we, the black people, shall not take back our land for 10 years, but we shall buy back our land for 10 years. But now, 1980 to 1990, we stuck with our agreement. We agreed to buy land from the whites. We agreed to pay for the land in foreign currency, our own land, just so that we want to show the world that we can reconcile with the enemy and we will not be enemies forever. We will share the resources, even though the resources are ours. But now, when it came to 1990, Zimbabwe had the authority to change the constitution and to put in that constitution the right to take land compulsorily and to pay what the government now felt was a right to pay for the land. From 1980 to 1990, the government had to pay land prices determined by estate agents. I don't think I have to ask you to guess who were the estate agents. It was a colonial country controlled by white estate agents. So they were the ones that were determining the price. And for those 10 years, these estate agents manipulated the prices of homes, the prices of land, so that the price of land would keep going up and the Zimbabwean government would not be able to pay for this land. And they did this in cahoots with the Americans, the British, and the Europeans, who then were giving white people money to buy property in Zimbabwe to take the property prices up. It is that very same period that the United States government bought the land that they built the second biggest embassy in Africa, in Zimbabwe, from land that was bought during the time that they were manipulating prices of land and property. So this, I'm just trying to show you the duplicitousness of these people within that time. So now Zimbabwe had the right to change its constitution. Come to 1990, they begin to talk about the changing of the constitution, but South Africa was getting its independence, and the negotiations for South African freedom after the whites had been defeated in the bush was happening. The South African ANC says, hold on, Zimbabwe, please don't take your land now, because if you take your land now, while we negotiate for these white people to give us power, they're going to be scared that we're going to do the same thing. So don't show them what taking land looks like. Don't show them how laws can be changed from the colonial laws to new laws. Just wait. So Zimbabwe said, it's fine. Take your country, write a new constitution, make sure that the country is stable. The Boers are not fighting, you are not fighting them, and so you've got peace. And then we will begin to take land. So between 1990, where Zimbabwe is supposed to change its constitution to take its land back, till 1997, Zimbabwe can't take land. But in the background, Mugabe is saying to the British, listen, we've bought land, we've given your children money. Now it's your turn to give us the money to take the land that we need for ourselves, because we need 8 million hectares of the 16 million hectares controlled by white people to give to our people. The British government then has the Tony Blair government coming in and saying, it's not our responsibility to pay for the previous government's promises. Imagine that.
Rutendo, I think you moved really quickly. The Lancaster Agreement that you talked about, most of our audience may not be familiar with it, our global audience. The Lancaster Agreement was the agreement at independence, which included that the British would pay for the lands that they dispossessed from the indigenous Africans when colonialism came and took over the lands, right? And then they said they would either pay or return the lands. I just want to clear that point as you're talking about this land possession and how basically Tony Blair, said it's not their business to pay for it, even though they had signed an agreement. So I just want to make sure that it's very clear.
And I think I like the fact that you just basically saying maybe I should just give a bit of context for historical knowledge for the people. That is so right. So when the liberation fighters were defeating these Rhodesians with the mercenaries that came from America, Britain, the mercenaries that were being paid by the American government behind the scenes, the American government saw that the Rhodesians were losing the war together with their mercenaries. So what they did is they put pressure on the countries that we called the frontline states. Now, according to the OAU, countries were supposed to assist those that were still colonized to receive their independence. But most of the assistance would come from the countries in the front or next to the country that's seeking independence. And they would give that country resources in terms of bases, in terms of weapons and food for liberation fighters. So we had what we called our frontline states, which were Zambia, Mozambique, Tanzania, where they met with the Kagames and the Musevenis, and Botswana. They were the independent African countries supporting Zimbabwe's war. And they were the ones giving refuge and bases to our liberation fighters. And most of the liberation fighters that were now winning the war were coming from Mozambique and Zambia, although they were training in Tanzania. So now, when Kissinger saw that the Rhodesian government was losing and was about to fall, he then put pressure on the Zambian government and the Mozambican government to say, listen, guys, you need to push the black liberation fighters, the terrorists, to go and negotiate with Ian Smith for the power to be returned to blacks in a peaceful manner rather than a total defeat of Europeans. What is interesting is this. Kaunda, who was the president of Zambia, had been duplicitous. He was supporting the liberation effort, but at the same time, he was in agreement with the whites that the Zimbabwean liberation fighters should not win a military victory. He wanted them not to win a military victory because he wanted the whites to continue to control industry, to control farming, so that Zambia could import the beef, the agricultural produce, and the industrial goods that it used to get from Rhodesia under colonialism. So Kaunda believed that total black victory and blacks taking over an economy in Rhodesia would not be beneficial for his country and the region. So he pressured our leaders to go to the negotiations, first of all in Switzerland, and then secondly in Britain. And the negotiations happened in a building called the Lancaster building, hence it's called the Lancaster Conference. What's actually interesting is I think all Lancaster House conferences even Kenya went to a Lancaster House conference. All colonies of the British, I think, negotiated their peace in the Lancaster House. So at the Lancaster House, with these men, liberators, who felt they could still fight and they were going to defeat the Rhodesians totally, it got to a point where they were now even bombing fuel tanks in the city center. They had gotten to a point where they could now enter the city center. There were no-go areas in Zimbabwe, meaning the war was won, but now they wanted to defeat the whites by going into their houses and killing them in their houses. And the British said, and the Americans, we're not going to have that precedence. We're not going to have Europeans pulled in the streets because they've been killed. We need a negotiation, and we need that negotiation to be forced. So Zambia pushed the liberation fighters, and so did Machel in Mozambique. Now you need to understand Machel's position. Machel had fought a war for his own country to liberate Mozambique. Eventually there was a collapse of the Portuguese government that eventually brought peace, but they were winning the war. So the country was destroyed. The Portuguese put salt, they put chemicals, they destroyed buildings, they destroyed the plumbing systems. They poisoned the soil to make sure that Mozambique would not be a viable country again before they left. So he was left with a tattered country. And while that country was tattered, he started supporting the liberation movement in Zimbabwe. And while he was supporting the liberation movement in Zimbabwe, there were UN sanctions on Rhodesia. So UN sanctions are legal because they are put in by a group of nations, unlike these sanctions Zimbabwe has put in by our colonizers. So the UN sanctions forced neighboring countries to shut Rhodesia off. But Mozambique made most of its money by Rhodesia sending its goods to port through Mozambique and getting its fuel through the Mozambican pipeline. By shutting down Mozambique shut down one of its biggest revenue streams in a country where the industry, the fields had been destroyed. So by the time we get to 1979, Mozambique is tired of the war. Economically, they're struggling. Renamo is also starting a war, 4 years of a war that is destabilizing Mozambique. So Machel needed aid from the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank. The World Bank, IMF, having American directors, British directors, and European directors, would not give him money to relieve his country. So they pressured him that if you want assistance, you must force these guys to go to the negotiation table with Smith and not prolong the war. And if they refuse to go to negotiate, you need to tell them that they can't come back into your country to continue the war if they're not happy with the terms. So we have an agreement on the table that was set by the British, Americans, and Europeans that has got terms that were not good for the liberation movement, that would have literally put the liberation movement in almost a losing position instead of a winning position that they were. So Mugabe became hard-headed in these negotiations and refused certain terms. He wanted one man, one vote. He wanted to make sure that the army, the police were given to the winning side. He wanted to make sure that land was going to be returned to the people when the British didn't want those kind of negotiations. Because the reason for the negotiation was to maintain white dignity so that they're not totally defeated, to maintain property rights that were colonial. And this is where I always try to explain to people that this thing called property rights,
that's an interesting tactic. Just real quick, right now we are in the middle of a campaign to push the recommendations and of the UN mapping report that came out of the Congo. Zimbabwe is implicated in it and everything. And as always, when the perpetrators start seeing that, the people are resisting and starting to turn the tide, they start talking about negotiating. So that trick of let's negotiate, keep us where we are. We want to keep, we want to stay where we are. And let's forget everything, let's erase history, let's erase accountability, let's erase justice, let's erase the truth, let's erase everything, let's start from zero as if nothing happened in the past is a very interesting thing. It's like, no, they had to deal with everything that happened. So it's a good thing, but I just wanted us to speed up because the audience is so engaged. They would like to also engage you in some questions, and we have limited broadcast time, but I do want to get to the land disposition and the repossession of the land. You know, if you can tie all the points together about the land, dispossession and repossession, the Congo invasion, and the sanctions today, and then you know, we'll proceed from there. I know Nadine's got like a whole plan, but it seems like she's already shown you the all the plan that we had, because you've covered so many of the points. It's really interesting.
Absolutely. I know the sad part is that we've got so much history to share, and there's always never enough time to share it. So basically, these guys are forced into negotiating an agreement that was already predetermined by the West to maintain their power. Then the liberation fighters refused, especially Robert Mugabe, of which the other guy, Joshua Nkomo, was willing to accept the terms. But Mugabe had been given a mandate that you do not accept a situation where we can't get our land back. So they had to compromise that you can't get your land back immediately. You'll get your land after 10 years where you can readjust the constitution. But the constitution that would be used from 1980 for 10 years until 1990 would be the Lancaster House Constitution that constituted these white interests. So what was agreed upon is that the British government, the American government, the Europeans would give $4 billion then to the Zimbabwean government to rebuild Zimbabwe and also to buy land and to develop the country. That money never came. The second agreement was when Zimbabwe needs to buy land, if they want the Europeans to be able to interact with them and they don't want a continuation of the sanctions that were already on Rhodesia, they had to accept that they were going to buy land. And they'll buy land by giving 50% of their own payment up in foreign currency, then the British and the Americans top up. So the very first land that was bought in Zimbabwe, many people say Zimbabwe started taking land in 2000 after 20 years. No, it's not correct. Zimbabwe started taking land from 1980, but they were buying it. And they had bought 3 million hectares by the time we get to 10 years, and they had already resettled 75,000 families. That process now needed to be speeded up so that they could get the 8 million hectares that they had planned. So that means that 5 million hectares was left. So this was what they were now negotiating. While the South Africans were negotiating their peace, Mugabe was talking with the British, the Americans behind the scenes to say, you now need to give me all the money that we agreed at Lancaster so that I can buy the land from your children, or else I'm going to take land without buying the land. 1997, the Blair government basically says, we're not going to give you money. We are not the Thatcher government that promised you that land. We're a new government that consists of people who come from previously colonized territories. So your agreement doesn't hold. Mugabe said, that's fine. I'm going to take the land. And right there, people who had been trying to resettle land without being resettled by government were now going and taking the land. And Mugabe did not send his army or police to take those people off that land, because now they were taking land. But there was no policy, there was no laws to allow this. But the people of Zimbabwe were saying, we can't wait for laws. We've been waiting for laws for 18 years. The liberation fighters who had fought had not been compensated for fighting for 17 years. They were now also saying that it's been 27 years, we now want our compensation. So Mugabe had to compensate the liberation fighters. He then had to go and allow people to settle on land and then start to change the laws. It's within changing those laws now that the opposition came in 2008. This movement that used to be a workers' union, that used to look out for workers' unions' rights against capital and white exploitation, all of a sudden forms a movement called the Broad Civil Alliance. The Broad-Based Civil Alliance then begins to say to the Zimbabwean people, don't allow the change of the constitution. Mugabe wants more powers, he wants to become like a king, and if you allow him to change the constitution, then he becomes a king, you won't take him out of power. What the Broad-Based Civil Alliance, which was a former trade union, did not tell the people is that the real reason why the constitution was being amended and the constitution was having new clauses put in is to take that land legally and to allow those people that are going to settle on that land to have legal title to the land. So the Zimbabwean government got defeated by the opposition through lies that were sponsored by the UN and NGOs and the Western governments that sponsored these opposition members to be on the ground telling people that Mugabe is going to come in, he's going to change the laws, he's going to be a king, he's never going to be removed from power. And with that, the amendment of the constitution that would have allowed the government to take land failed to get into the constitution. 3 months later, were the elections. So the opposition had a win already. They had won to make people say no change to constitution. And they had lobbied in the country free. They were not hindered by anybody. I even left South Africa and went to one of their seminars, and there was no one stopping them from talking. And so they won this non-change to the constitution, which then therefore forced ZANU-PF to use its majority in parliament to change the act that allows land to be taken. So with that, then we have go into elections 3 months later. The opposition has spent so much effort campaigning for no change to the constitution. They didn't campaign enough for the elections. So with these elections, they got 57 seats to ZANU-PF's 61 seats, 4 seats difference. The Commonwealth observers say these are the best elections in terms of advancing democracy in Zimbabwe. Other people also say the same thing. And all of a sudden, the European observers say they were not free and fair, the opposition were in trouble, but nobody ever saw these beatings like what we saw in Kenya, like what we saw in Uganda. We've never seen that in Zimbabwe. We don't, in our culture, killing people is seen as something that will bring you so much bad luck that we don't do it. But we got put under sanctions in 2001 because apparently our elections were not free and fair and people were abused. And we don't know those people that are said to be abused. Specifically, when you see an opposition getting 4 seats less than the ruling party. Because if the government wanted to rig, they would have just won all the seats so that they don't have to have the opposition in parliament. And we are the only country in the world where we have an opposition movement that commits treason against its people, that goes to foreign countries and asks those foreign countries to impose war on its people. Only country in the world that has such treasonous people running all our urban municipalities, sitting in our parliament, being paid by the government that they are sabotaging, and the same government which they're asking the foreigners to destroy. And the reason that is happening is Zimbabwe does not have laws to punish Zimbabweans that go and ask foreign forces to attack their own country. And I have been one of the first people to say the government has got to have a law that stops Zimbabweans from collaborating with enemies of the state without repercussions. Because in America, it will never happen. In Britain, it will never happen. In Europe, it will never happen.
Quick question. Is the opposition party in Zimbabwe promoting sanctions on the country?
They actually were the ones that wrote the sanctions document. They were lawyers within the opposition party that drafted the sanctions document and were negotiating and workshopping with the Americans and the Europeans on how to impose sanctions so that when the presidential elections come in 2002, from 2000 where they
fantastic afternoon. So long.